right, thanks so much, Hillary. Can you all hear me? You're hearing me okay? Yeah, great, thank you. Well, good evening. I hope you're all doing well under the circumstances. I just wanted to note that since we're talking about a luxury food, chocolate, and Jews and the connection to chocolate, that you might keep in mind that there are lots of people suffering from food insecurity at this point. And I've noted at the bottom of this first slide that there are a number of places where we can make donations if you're so inclined, not only to think about chocolate tonight, but also to consider, if you haven't already, or if you have already, maybe again, donating to one of these places that helps the many, many people who are suffering from hunger at this point. The title of my book is On the Chocolate Trail, and then it's followed, as you can see on the slide, by that very, very long subtitle, A Delicious Adventure, and so on and so forth, which is a publisher-generated title and subtitle, because I wanted the title to be Googleable, if that's the right word. And but the title of the book means several things to me. First of all, On the Chocolate Trail means or refers to the traveling that chocolate has done throughout the world since it first was used and enjoyed in Central and South America. The chocolate trail also came to mean, for me, the traveling that my husband and I, Mark Hurwitz, and I did as we were researching the stories of religions and chocolate and Jews and chocolate. So we were on a trail of research. And the third meaning of the title of the book, On the Chocolate Trail, refers to the traveling that I did since the book came out, that I've done, to share the stories of Jews and chocolate, and rituals and chocolate, and religions and chocolate. And I'm thrilled to be with you tonight by Zoom. And I have been to Chicago to a couple of venues there, and I'm happy to come back at some point when things open up again to share further stories. I'd like to suggest that you keep in mind that chocolate is an immigrant food, and it traveled with Jewish immigrants who were nurtured and sustained in the chocolate business since the time of the expulsion from Spain. And these stories are about resilience and overcoming obstacles. They're also about the migration of chocolate as a beverage on the part of Sephardim Jews descended from and connected to Spain. And it itself is a migrant food. As I said before, it has traveled throughout the world as various peoples have brought it with them and enjoyed it with them throughout the last many centuries. So I imagine that many of you like chocolate, and if you would like to indicate in the chat that you do, or you'd like to, I don't know if there's a poll on your toolbar, you could raise your hand and indicate that you like chocolate. And perhaps also in the chat, you'd like to indicate that you have maybe enjoyed chocolate in a Jewish setting. And I'm showing you the slide, and maybe what that setting might have been, what was the Jewish setting in which you've enjoyed chocolate in particular. You could write that in the chat. And I'm showing you a slide from Seinfeld. Is that a babka? Is that a Jewish babka? What is babka? They took our babka, you know, that scene from Seinfeld. So I have a confession.
That was our babka.
That was their babka. I have a confession to make. And this has to do with an adult onset self-diagnosed syndrome. It comes upon me serendipitously. I can't control it. It just happens various times. It's what I call my chocodar, my radar for chocolate experiences. And perhaps some of you have a similar syndrome, chocodar, radar for chocolate experiences. It's irrepressible, it's serendipitous, it just happens. And it is what led me to write the book. And I'll tell you a few stories tonight related to the book and how the book came to be. First of all, I'll tell you a very general story about chocodar to help you understand what I mean by my radar for chocolate experiences. Then I'll tell you some of the stories of Jews on the chocolate trail, and particularly one story that led me to write the book. And then I'll tell you a very personal story about me, chocolate, and chocodar. So the next time you pick up a piece of chocolate, you might consider that it might be related to your own Choco-Dar, your own radar for chocolate experiences. And it certainly is going to mean that you're partaking in a little bit of Jewish history. So here's the first general story to help you understand about Choco-Dar and what I mean by that. About, well, over 10 years ago, Mark and I, my husband and I, moved into a studio apartment in New York City. I came to New York, we moved to New York from San Diego County, where I'd been a congregational rabbi for a number of years, so that I could take a position with the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the professional organization of Reform rabbis. And we moved into the studio apartments. Around the corner from us is a food emporium, basically a grocery store. And that food emporium grocery store was closed for remodeling. And I really didn't pay attention to the fact that it was closed. I just figured there's plenty of food in New York. I'm busy at work. I'm not going to worry about the food. Just go to another store around the corner, another block, whatever, and we'll be fine. And 6 months after we moved into this studio apartment, the food emporium grocery store reopened. And lo and behold, what did they have but a room devoted to chocolate, a chocolate room. And what you're seeing in the slide here is just a corner of that chocolate room at the food emporium. When we moved into our apartment, we had no idea that there would be a chocolate room in this grocery store around the corner from us, but it was my Choco-Dar, my radar for chocolate experiences, that kicked in when we moved in. Lo and behold, there was chocolate. It supplied our daily dosages for a long time. When you're able to come back to New York, don't go looking for it, because it closed a number of years ago when the laws of the state of New York changed to allow grocery stores to sell liquor, and it was since replaced by liquor. But it was well stocked with chocolate from around the world, and it supplied our daily dosages of chocolate. And it was larger than our studio apartment. So that is one story of my radar for chocolate experiences, my Choco-Dar. It was Choco-Dar also that led to my learning about the relationship between Jews and chocolate, and ultimately also led to the book. This is a photograph of Mark and me a number of years ago, and we were on a sabbatical trip in Europe, afforded by my congregation. The time was afforded by my congregation in San Diego. We rented that VW van in the background to travel from community to community over a period of about 2.5 months, from Shabbat to Shabbat. Our goal was to visit Reform congregations or liberal congregations where there were not full-time rabbis or even maybe part-time rabbis, so that we could visit with them, maybe participate in the service, maybe help them out, and at least get to know them. So that was our goal of travel while we were in Europe. Before we left on this trip, we were planning, and we were to pick up the van in Amsterdam and then drive south through Europe and around through several, about 10 countries. And we were picking up the van in March, which is still cold in Europe. And we were planning the trip to be in the warmest parts of Europe as possible at the particular time of our travel. So Mark wanted to basically quickly travel through Paris, and I wanted to spend more time in Paris. He had been to Paris, I had not been to Paris. We were involved in this conversation. Some people would call an argument about whether to spend time in Paris or not. We went back and forth and back and forth. And on Valentine's Day, about a month before we were to leave for our trip to Europe, I happened, Choco-Dar, to be at home exercising before I went to my study for the day. I happened, Choco-Dar, to turn on National Public Radio, and I happened, Choco-Dar, to pick up a story from Paris about chocolate in Paris in honor of Valentine's Day. So I was exercising and listening to this description of the wonderful chocolate in Paris. I was schwitzing and salivating, kind of absorbing all of this reality about the beautiful chocolate in Paris. And later on that night, Mark and I finally reconnected, and I said to him, well, you know that there's chocolate in Paris? And he said, oh, there's chocolate in Paris. I'll reroute the trip. So he did reroute the trip so that we could spend some time in Paris. I took my map of Paris and I identified the cultural sites and the chocolate shops that we wanted to visit. Cultural sites, chocolate shops. Louvre, chocolate shop. Montmartre, chocolate shop. You get the idea. It was to maximize our time and to be able to get to all the beautiful cultural places we wanted to visit, as well as to have the opportunity to enjoy the chocolate. When we went to a lot of chocolate shops, and those of you who have been to Paris know that there is amazingly delicious and aesthetically satisfying and appealing chocolate there. And we happened to go into a chocolate shop that was not mentioned on that radio broadcast, called L'Atelier du Chocolat de Bayonne, where they have this very thin, I don't know if you can see from the slide, but it's very, very thin, multicolored, multiple flavors chocolate. And this studio for the chocolate, for the making of chocolate from Bayonne, France, has a number of locations around France, including several in Paris. We happened to go into this one, Chocodar, and I happened to pick up this company literature, and I happened to read in my high school French what it says here in the red highlighted box, that, but this was my high school French, keep in mind, that Jews exiled from Spain brought chocolate making to Bayonne, France. In the East Coast, I have to be careful to say this is Bayonne and not Bayonne, New Jersey. People get confused. Our Bayonne, New Jersey is probably named after that Bayonne. But it basically says Jews brought chocolate making to France. And I, after all those years of Hebrew school and Sunday school and confirmation and teaching adults and children about Judaism, and 5 years of the Hebrew Union College Seminary, I had never heard this idea that Jews brought chocolate making to France. And I reread it because it was after all my high school French, and then I said, there may be something to this. And I thought about the exile and dispersions of Jews, Sephardi Jews from Spain. I thought about they went east, but those aren't so much chocolate stories. These are the dispersions west from Spain and north from Spain in the green lines. And then you see in the blue and the red circles with stars that there are some other cities highlighted. The red cities highlight chocolate centers in this early period of European contact with chocolate. Chocolate initially is from Central and South America. Europeans had contact with it first in Columbus's fourth voyage. And these highlighted red circles, Newport, New York, London, Amsterdam, Bayonne, Martinique, are places where Sephardi Jews had some unique association with chocolate, and in some cases were known as chocolate specialists. So it began to make sense to me that this idea articulated in that company literature that I happened to find in Bayonne, in Paris, made some sense given what I'm describing in this slide and what you're seeing in that slide. The important thing to keep in mind here is that there was no eating chocolate in these first centuries of a European contact with chocolate. There's no bars for eating chocolate. There's no chocolate chip cookies, chocolate ice cream, chocolate cake, truffles. None of that existed. Chocolate was only a beverage. And you had to access the beans. They had to be roasted over an open fire. They had to be shelled. They had to be ground on a stone, a piedra, a metate, a pierre. Different cultures have different names for this. It was often, this grinding process was often done by slaves or indentured servants, because it's so laborious. And I don't want to make this sound like it's secondary or not important, but it is important. It is, I do want to say that chocolate is a colonial extract product, and it does have colonial ingredients, and given the concerns in our country and the Black Lives Matter movement that we're quite aware of at this point, that there are issues of that are discomforting to us about our chocolate, and slave trade is very much a part of the chocolate story, and we can talk about that later if you have questions about it. So I don't want to overlook that or bypass that. That is the topic of another conversation. However, you might see under this warming stone, or the stone, a warming pan that made the processing of the beans easier. And then once the chocolate was ground into a paste, it would have been rolled into a ball or a tablet like you see at the front of the painting, and then stored for use until the family or the individual was ready to make it into their chocolate. If you were lucky to have a jade chocolate pot for storing your chocolate, that's great, like you see on the left hand of the slide. In colonial North America, people were using old newspapers or rags for storing their chocolate. Hygiene was not exactly what we expect of our chocolate today. When you were ready for your hot chocolate beverage, you would grate the chocolate tablet or ball into the chocolate pot that you see on the right-hand side of the page, add some water, warm it over a fire, and stir it with a stirrer, the wooden stick that you see coming a moyo-noyo, and then you would have your drinking chocolate. Eating chocolate doesn't come till later, as I said. On the left-hand side of this slide, you see my friend Luis making chocolate with a stirrer in his regular soup pot, not a specialized chocolate pot. And you see the pile of stirrers or hand lathed stirrers in Oaxaca, Mexico at the market there. There's our eating chocolate. Okay, so that gives us a sense of the reality of the beverage and how hard it was to make it. And now let's come to some of the Jewish stories that just a very brief sampling of some of them. These are Sephardi stories initially. And here we have a story that has to do with Oxford, England, and the first coffee house there that was founded in 1650. And this is on the Grand Street on the High Street at the Grand Cafe in Oxford, England, where this marker can be found today. To identify the location of the first coffee house, believe me, it was not anything like the Grand Cafe or like a Starbucks or like any coffee house that you would expect it to look like. It was probably more like a very primitive lean-to. And the person who was making coffee there was also making chocolate, probably using that stone that you saw, a stone like you saw in the earlier slide. And the individual who brought chocolate and coffee to England, to Oxford in 1650, the first coffee house in England where there was also chocolate, was named Jacob the Jew, a Sephardi individual. And I'm showing you what the Grand Cafe in the High Street looks like today. And there's the hot chocolate that we tasted. I'm not going to show you every single hot chocolate that we tasted, but there was plenty. Now we're going to go to North America, to the British colonies, for another story about Sephardi individuals in the colonies who were in the chocolate trade and manufacture and retail and consumption. And in New York City, we have the stories of the Gomez family, Sephardi family. And in Newport, Rhode Island, we have a cousin-related family, the Aaron Lopez family, Newport, Rhode Island. All of them very philanthropic, all of them very involved in the Jewish community, their respective Jewish communities, all of them Sephardim, all of them in the chocolate business. Now, what you're looking at in this slide is an advertisement from one of the individuals in the Gomez family in New York. Rebecca Gomez was one of 5 individuals in 2 generations in the Gomez family who was in the chocolate business. They were founders of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. They were philanthropic, both Jewishly and non-Jewishly, and she's advertising her chocolate business at the chocolate manufactory at the corner of Ann and Nassau Street, which some of you probably know is downtown in New York. And she's identifying her own manufactured chocolate, warranted, free from any sediments and pure. Great allowance made to those who buy to sell again, which is what is written at the bottom right-hand part of that advertisement. This is a dry goods shop, but she's highlighting her chocolate. And I love the name. It's the Chocolate Manufactory. And she's retailing, she's wholesaling, and she's talking about the quality of her chocolate. Rebecca was the only Jewish woman that I was able to find in the chocolate business in the colonial period anywhere, and one of just a handful of women who were in the chocolate business. Most of them were widows. And now, just a moment for Aaron Lopez in Newport, Rhode Island, founder of the Touro Synagogue, at one time the richest individual in Newport, Rhode Island. His chocolate business was pretty significant as well. And he was responsible for the Jewish community's distribution of tzedakah foodstuffs to poor people, and included in those disbursements of food for people who were poor was chocolate. We also have from his records a note in one of his account books that he paid another Sephardi individual for grinding chocolate for him for Passover, the first record that I know of that connects chocolate and Passover in the middle of the 18th century. Now we're going to move on to another Sephardi story, and that is the story of Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai. This is the first rabbinic written record I know of about chocolate. He is known also as the Hida. Chaim Yosef David Azulai was born, I believe, in the Holy Land. He lived in the Holy Land, and he was sent from the Holy Land to Europe to visit Jewish communities, to raise money to send back to support the Jewish community in the Holy Land. He was born in 1724. As I said, he was Sephardi. Here's a map that shows, you have to look very carefully to see the arrows, but you see he traveled in lots of places: Italy, France, and Holland, the Netherlands. And he kept a diary of his travels called Ma'agal Tov. And in his diary, he records at least 10 times that when he was visiting various Jewish communities, they either gave him gifts of chocolate for making the chocolate beverage, or they drank chocolate together, or when he was in Amsterdam on one occasion, he was at a bris, and they drank chocolate to celebrate the Seudat Mitzvah, the mitzvah of the celebration of the food, the meal at the celebration of the fulfillment of bris. So here we had the Ma'agal Tov and his record in his diary of eating and drinking chocolate, really mostly drinking chocolate, all over Europe. Now what I'm showing you in this slide is a contemporary chocolate pot from Spain and accompanying pots. It's a contemporary Spanish set for chocolate and drinking chocolate, but it gives me the opportunity to tell you some stories that have to do with Jews living in New Spain, basically Mexico. These are conversos, secretly practicing Jews who left Spain to be further away from the hardships of the Inquisition. The Inquisition did exist in New Spain and Mexico, and they were secretly practicing their Judaism, but they were more comfortable being there. Excuse me. And they secreted chocolate into their Jewish practices. So these Jews living in New Spain and Mexico were drinking chocolate for Kiddush on Friday nights. They were drinking chocolate before the fast of Yom Kippur started, and to break the fast of Yom Kippur, of the Day of Atonement, they were drinking chocolate as well. And they were very worried about being outed to the Inquisition by their non-Jewish servants. And so they were very careful about their chocolate consumption, because there was a pervasive chocolate culture. People were drinking chocolate for breakfast and chocolate for supper. And if they were not seen to be drinking their chocolate for breakfast or during the Day of Atonement or another Jewish fast day, they might have been, in fact, given over to the Inquisition or reported to the Inquisition by their non-Jewish servants or neighbors. So this is there's a lot more information about these Jews in New Spain and their chocolate consumption and their chocolate businesses, and that's in the book. So those were Sephardi stories of Jews on the chocolate trail, and now we come to a couple of Ashkenazi stories. Many of you are, not all of you, are probably familiar with Sachertorte. It is certainly a favorite. Mark and I were able to taste it in Vienna. Perhaps some of you have as well. And it's a Jewish story, surprisingly. I don't think the family is still Jewish, but the individual who is said to have created the Sachertorte, Franz, was 16. He was interning or staging at the home of Prince von Metternich in Vienna. He had to cover or substitute for the head chef one night because the chef became ill, so he had to throw together a dinner for the company that was coming that night at the prince's home. And at the last minute, he created this chocolate cake, which many of you probably know is a layer of marmalade, usually apricot chocolate cake, 2 layers filled with apricot marmalade and chocolate, and then covered, as you can see, totally immersed in chocolate. And so the Sachertorte has Jewish roots. And then we have this other Ashkenazi story, which is a little bit more recent than that. This is Albert Einstein's childhood chocolate cup gifted to him by his parents. His sister Maya had a cup as well. The 2 cups, each with their respective images on them, are in the collection of the Leo Baeck Institute in New York City. And when Albert Einstein left Europe, he died. His longtime assistant gifted them to the Leo Baeck Institute, and they are still there. And we were lucky that when we were able to do an exhibit about Jews and chocolate at the Bernard Museum in New York City, we were able to display these cups.
Rabbi Prince, I'm sorry to interrupt. We keep losing you a little bit when you're speaking. I don't know if you need to get closer to your microphone or...
Thank you for letting me know. I'm sorry. Let me turn off my air. Maybe that'll help. Tell me again if you can't hear me. Thank you for letting me know. Is this better?
Yes.
Is it sounding better? Okay. Okay. So Mark and I were able to go back to Europe on another trip, and we wanted specifically to be able to learn more about this chocolate story from Bayonne, France. And you can see from the map here that Bayonne is very close to Spain and Portugal, it's in southwest France. It was a very significant port in its day. It was also on a trade route. People I'm sure there were other things being traded here, but I do know that cocoa beans were imported to Spain and Portugal from the New World, and they were traveled through Bayonne and up to Amsterdam and London, and Jews were involved in that chocolate trade. They were and they were living in Bayonne. And we know that there were Jews living in Bayonne also because we have there's a hot chocolate that we had there. 1 second, I want to show you the next slide. Well, before I go to the next slide, let me just call your attention to the fact that you see the foam on the hot chocolate, and you see the whipped cream on the top right-hand part of to the right, upper right of the hot chocolate. The foam comes from the hand stirring that you saw earlier. The foam is not from the whipped cream. So when we tasted this hot chocolate in Bayonne, we were basically, our taste buds were percolated back to Spain and the New Spain, and also to Mexico. And it had the flavors of those Spanish Mexican flavors. So I want to show you that Jews were living in Bayonne because we know we have this ketubah for sure from 1695. These folks got married in Bayonne, and you have, for those of you who are Hebrew readers, Bayonne spelled right there in the red. And we traveled around Bayonne, and we went to a lot of chocolate shops. There are several company-owned chocolate museums. And everywhere we went, whether it was the chocolate museums and their labels, such as these right here, we learned that and repeatedly they were telling the same basic story. Jews brought chocolate making to France. We went into this chocolate museum in Biarritz, the neighboring town. I asked the owner's daughter, what's the story with Jews bringing chocolate to France? And she said, mais oui, but of course Jews brought chocolate making it to France. Like, there's nothing to discuss. There's no question at all. And so we were reminded repeatedly of this idea that Jews brought chocolate making to France, whether it was on the town tourist literature such as this, or on their website at the time, or whether it was on postcards that we picked up as we were wandering. All of these repeatedly said, Jews exiled from Spain brought chocolate making to France. And yet, Jews who were in the chocolate business in Bayonne suffered a number of disabilities, perhaps very similar to what they had experienced in other places in Europe. The Jews who were in the chocolate business were prohibited from living in Bayonne. They had to live in the neighborhood of Saint-Esprit, the neighboring town or the suburb of Saint-Esprit. They could not actually leave their chocolate making equipment. They could not have a retail shop in Bayonne. This is the site of a contemporary building where an older individual in the 18th century had tried, a Sephardi individual, a Jew, had tried to establish a retail business, and he was fined for doing so. His name was Andrade. Jews who, so they couldn't retail in Bayonne. They couldn't be in Bayonne after sunset. They couldn't work on Christian feast days or on Sundays. So it's a little bit of the same old story that Jews suffered. They were in the chocolate business, and at least they had some income, and at least they were making chocolate. Now, when the French Postal Service decided to honor the French chocolate industry and the history of chocolate in France, they issued this plate of chocolate stamps, which is just really beautiful. I think this was about 2009. In the top row, in the middle, you see what I think is a conquistador, possibly Columbus. We can come back to that if you want. On the top row, all the way on your left, Cocoa Pods. I'll show you a photograph of that, Cocoa Pods, in a few minutes. Underneath the Cocoa Pods, maybe French royalty. We know that one queen took her medicine with chocolate. In the middle of the bottom row, we see a chocolate bar. To the right of the chocolate bar, we see a chocolate pot and a chocolate cup, and a child to the right of that, a child eating chocolate. And right above, we see that the French Postal Service has identified Bayonne as significant in the history of chocolate in France. And in Bayonne, they privileged the story that Jews brought chocolate making to France. We will probably never know who brought the first cocoa beans, who brought the first chocolate stone, who brought the first recipe for making chocolate, but that's the story that they tell there, and that's the story that they're sticking with. Now, I've told you the general Choco Dar story about the chocolate room around the corner from us. I gave you a few examples of chocolate and Jews and how the book came to be. It led, that first encounter with that company literature in Paris led me to write the book and do the research. And now I'm going to tell you a personal story of my Choco Dar, my radar for chocolate experiences. About, I'd say almost 10 years ago again, I went to a conference at the Center for Jewish History in New York City on Jewish merchants in the colonial period. And I raised my hand and I asked, does anybody know anything about Jews and chocolate in the merchant business and in the colonial period? And there was total silence in the room. Like, this is an academic conference and this woman is asking about chocolate. What do the two have in common? And so I was basically quiet after that. And somebody came up to me at the break and said, well, he happened to know that there's an archival collection of materials in Jerusalem in Dutch about Jews and chocolate. And I said, oh, Dutch, oh, Jerusalem, oh, well, I think I'll continue to do some research on my own and see how much I can find, because I don't know when I'm going to get to Jerusalem, and I don't certainly speak Dutch. And it sounded as though there were a lot of materials, and it turns out to be 140 boxes of archival materials, and that's a lot to translate. It would have been very expensive. So I sort of put it in the back burner and didn't do anything with it. And I had plenty to research and plenty of material for the book without the particular story or stories that might have been buried in that Dutch archives in Jerusalem. And in 2012, just before the book is published and the edits are pretty much done, the photographs are selected, the book is about to go to the press, and I'm pretty much finished with the definitely finished with the research. Mark and I are in Jerusalem, actually, and we had a few extra days, and I said, hey, Mark, let's go to the archives and see what we can see. So we find our way to this kind of obscure corner of the campus of the Hebrew University. We find the archives. I've already requested from offsite, sort of randomly, a few boxes from the collection of this individual, whose name, by the way, is on this article from the Jerusalem Post, Isaac Prins, P-R-I-N-S, Chaco Dar #1, same last name. Is this Dutch? Mine is probably Germanic, but it's basically the same name. Chaco Dar #1, same name. And I've randomly requested these boxes. I don't know what's going to be in them. A lot of it is Dutch scribbles on little tiny pieces of paper, totally meaningless to me. And probably even if I'd read Dutch, would have been meaningless, because I don't know that anybody could have deciphered that handwriting. And then Mark finds this article from the Jerusalem Post in English. We're able to read that. I'm reading through it. I'm saying, oh, this is interesting. This is what he found. How nice. I didn't know about that. Too bad I didn't know about it before I finished the book. And then I get to the last part of the article, which you see highlighted in the red. The present writer has written a book on Jews and chocolate, and a history of Israel chocolate making is in preparation as the second part of the work. And I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. I'm mortified because I've researched my book and it's ready to go to the press. And my publisher and I believe that my book on the chocolate trail is the first ever book about Jews and chocolate and chocolate and religions. And I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. Should I tell my publisher? Shouldn't I tell my publisher? Maybe I can find the book. Maybe I can find the two books. I asked the archivist, where is the book? Is there a manuscript? Is there a manuscript? Do you know anything about it? She says, no, nothing. We don't have anything like that. And I figure, okay, she doesn't know. Maybe I can find it at a library. So I go online to all the major Jewish collections around the world. I look through the catalogs. I look for his name. Nothing. Then I write to Brill Publishing, which is in the Netherlands, because I saw a little note in the papers about Brill Publishing. I figured, well, maybe he tried to get his book published at Brill, or maybe they published his book through Brill, an academic press. And they were kind enough to respond to me, and they said, no, we don't know of him, Dr. Prins. We don't know of a book about Jews and chocolate, nothing. So then I'm stymied. I don't know what else to do, except that I write a story about the weird Chaco Dar connection, same interest, same last name, and I put it on my website, and I just put it out into the virtual world. And about, 3 to 5 months later, I get a comment to my post about this weird Chaco Darish connection, same name, same interest. I get a comment from a man who turns out to be Prins's nephew, who says, yeah, he used to visit with Prins in Israel. Prins told him, the nephew, that he was writing a book, but the book was never published and there is no manuscript. So I was so relieved. On one hand, I'm relieved because there's no other book. I didn't overlook something significant, and my book will still be the first book ever about Jews and chocolate. On the other hand, I feel sad for Dr. Prince because he wanted to write a book and wouldn't have been nice, and for him to publish his book. And also, I probably could have learned from the material that he had, because he's researching in a different language and different experiences in different parts of the world, and he probably had material that I didn't know about. So very weird. Very weird, because not only is it the same name and the same interest, but the same birthday. Not birth year, but we share the same birthday. Anyway, the book did come out. It's now in its second edition. I'm very excited about the second edition. And it is available at Amazon in hardcover, or paperback, and electronic. And there are 3 free downloads available to you at my website if you're interested, if you're in a book club. And I know that Hillary is in 2, I think you said. There's discussion guides for book clubs, free download. There's a Haggadah for the celebration of a socially conscious Seder celebration using chocolate ritual foods, but a kind of elevated conversation about social justice and food justice and worker justice for Pesach. And there's also lesson plans for teachers who are teaching in Jewish settings about how to smear your classroom with chocolate. So those are free downloads at the website. Very excited that the book was the basis for this exhibit that we did, as I said, at the Bernard Museum in New York City. This is just the very preliminary entryway into the exhibit. So you just see a little bit of what it looked like. The stories from the book about Jews and chocolate provided the foundation for the exhibit, which is available to travel. Obviously, nothing is traveling right now, and nobody's traveling right now, or few of us are. And but it is available to institutions that don't require security. It doesn't require security. It does not require humidity control. It is basically photographs and facsimiles and all the explanatory materials that travel. And I'm so excited that it will hopefully one day again be available to folks who are interested. Now, this is what where your chocolate comes from. It does come from a tree. I'm not going to argue to you that it's necessarily healthy because it grows on a tree. But you know, those pods that grow off the side of the tree are about the size of a small football. They can be multiple colors. There's a harvest every 6 months or so. You have to slice that pod open to get inside to see the pulp. And inside the pulp are seeds that are purplish. They do not look brown. They do not taste like chocolate. They do not smell like chocolate until they are fermented and dried and roasted. So there's a big process, as you saw earlier, starting from here through the grinding and the roasting and the grinding. Obviously, industrially, it's an even more sophisticated process, but it's ultimately all has to be processed, and then you have your chocolate. It is kind of miraculous that somebody figured out how to get from that point of those purplish seeds to the chocolate that we enjoy together today, whether it's a beverage or a food. And not surprising that the scientific term for chocolate is theobroma, the food of the gods. Mark and I generally eat it pretty religiously almost every day. Now, I realize that some of you might be eating chocolate or can't resist eating chocolate now that we've been speaking about it for such a long time. But that's the bracha, the blessing for chocolate. It is customarily shehakol. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, through whose word everything comes into being. And I'm going to stop to take questions, and then we'll bring it to an end, if there are questions.
There are lots of questions.
All right.
Fascinating. I love chocolate. I hope you saw my thumbs up a few times that I could eat and drink chocolate all day long. I try not to. So can you just explain a little bit? You you started this road trip, and was it specifically for synagogues, and then you added in this
Right.
chocolate part?
Right. Only when we came across that passage in the company literature, at L'Atelier de Chocolat de Bayonne, at that chocolate shop, did I even connect. I mean, that was my first hint that there was some sort of connection between Jews and chocolate, and I figured it's a chocolate company. What do they know about Jewish history? And but lo and behold, with more research, partly while we were in Europe on that trip, and partly a lot since then, I learned that there was a lot more to it. And there's a lot of different stories. For instance, maybe you've wondered how did Hanukkah gelt come to be chocolate? Well, I deal with that in the book. Israeli chocolate I deal with in the book. The colonial period in North America. There's a lot of stories. Holocaust and refugee chocolate. Also, so it was primarily that first trip was intended to be traveling, learning, visiting those congregations, and the chocolate just was a surprise add-on. Dessert.
Like that. Dessert. Chocolate goes with anything, right?
Dessert, as it were.
Was all the chocolate that you tasted hechshered, kosher, or?
No, I don't require my chocolate to be hechshered. I can pretty much read the ingredients in my chocolate. So I know what's in the chocolate, generally speaking. I also know that there are very few companies that mix anything into the chocolate that is trafe, overtly trafe. Like I've never come across a shellfish chocolate, but I have come across and almost tasted once, but I didn't because I stopped myself in time, a bacon covered chocolate. And in fact, Vosges, which is, your local chocolate in one of the significant chocolate companies, but it's Chicago-based company, their big line is bacon covered chocolate, right? But so I pretty much rely on my reading of the label and the ingredients. And there are issues in my mind with regard to hechshering, kosher certification for chocolate. If you have that requirement, I don't want to take it away from you or diminish it in any way. I would just share that, for instance, when it comes to Pesach chocolate, the hechsher for the kosher certification for Passover has no relationship whatsoever to the question of where that chocolate comes from, or whether there's any slave labor, child slave labor, or inappropriate child labor in that chocolate bar, except for one or two brands. I know that Equal Exchange is very careful about its chocolate sourcing, and Equal Exchange was formerly fair traded, and it now is fairly traded, meaning that they have direct contact with their farmers. They know exactly who's working on the farms and where they are, and they know that there is no child labor on those farms. So, and they are kosher hechshered for Pesach, and kosher, generally speaking, and also for Pesach. So it's one of the few, if not the only, products that has both. So at Passover, I'd rather be buying a chocolate that I know has, or can be pretty certain has no child labor in it, rather than have a formally Passover certified chocolate. We can talk more about that if you have other questions or concerns. I do think it's a really important issue, given that the United States Department of Labor did a study. I don't think they've done a follow-up since 2015. But it was as recent as 2015 that found that over 2 million children in West African chocolate growing, particularly Ghana and Ivory Coast, are either enslaved or are working in dangerous circumstances in the chocolate growing and harvesting business.
I think it's an interesting point. Do you think that there are other products besides chocolate that, as Jews who may keep kosher, are eating, that, are employing these same types of processes with children and
You know, I'm not familiar 100% with all products, and I think I have a chocolate brain, so I primarily about chocolate. Nothing is coming to mind right now, but I will give that some thought. It's a good question.
Karen asked if the chocolate trail ran parallel to the coffee trail during the expulsion. Do you know anything about that?
So the coffee trail is interesting, and some of you may have read The Coffee Trader by David Liss, which is a lovely Jewish sort of exploration of coffee. And there's been some academic work on coffee, coffee houses, from a Jewish perspective, coffee houses, Jews in the coffee trade. They don't really parallel in terms of sources or in terms of how they're both roasted, obviously, but the people who were trading chocolate, as far as I know, and the ones that I've identified and looked at, are not, to my knowledge, involved in the coffee business as well. So while The Coffee Trader, the novel, does open with the main character tasting chocolate, the drink, and not really liking it, and then sort of gets left. So there's a bit of a coincidence there of the chocolate and the coffee thing. I didn't find a lot of it. However, I will say that my publisher wanted me to kind of do a series of books about beans, like you did chocolate beans, which are really not beans, actually they're seeds. And now do coffee, now do vanilla, now do, garbanza. But I didn't, somebody else had not so long after I did the chocolate trail, did a book about coffee, and from a Jewish perspective, and it was rather thorough, and I didn't think that there was really that much there for me to uncover or to deal with. Although I do love to combine chocolate with coffee. The two together are just great.
I've never tasted a coffee bean, not a coffee bean or a cocoa bean, but have you actually tasted an unprocessed cocoa bean, and how would you describe it?
I have. It was kind of fruity, sweet, kind of sweet, a little bit sweet. The pulp around the seed is sweet and mushy. And you can, if you look hard enough, some places it's easier to find than other places, find juices made from the pulp. It doesn't taste like chocolate. It's very sweet, but it is a product of the cocoa pod. And I would just say that sometimes people ask me, what is the most, isn't chocolate healthy? After all, it comes from a tree, from a fruit. And I said before what I said, it's not, I'm not sure that's just because it comes from the tree doesn't necessarily make it healthy, because after all, we've added in a lot of sugar and it's been processed. But one of the perhaps healthiest forms in which you can find chocolate is the nib, or the bean. It's after it's been fermented, dried, and roasted. And you can find these online or at health food stores, either as the bean itself, the little bean, or pieces of the bean. And they're often called cocoa nibs or cocoa beans. And they, like if you put them in your oatmeal, they'll melt into they'll give you a little chocolatey taste. I sometimes bake with them, and the book has recipes, 25 historical and contemporary recipes. And there are a few recipes in there that use the cocoa nibs, just the little pieces of the bean. And it gives it's different from a chocolate chip. It's a bit crunchier and a different flavor.
So during the Inquisition, when people were drinking chocolate for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, were these wealthy families? I mean, was it expensive to get chocolate at that time?
Good question, thank you. So I don't think it was expensive because it was pretty local. I mean, it was growing not so far away. It's expensive for us because it's shipped partly, and partly because the processing is expensive. It probably should be more expensive for us, by the way, because if it were more expensive for us, the people at the beginning of the chocolate chain would have better incomes. The people who are harvesting our cocoa beans, for the most part, whether they're in South America, Central America, or West Africa, where it's probably even worse, or for that matter, the small parts of Vietnam and other parts of the world where 20 degrees north of the equator, 20 degrees south of the equator, where chocolate or cocoa beans can grow, they should be paid more. They barely eke out a living. They're very impoverished and they live very, very primitive and basic lives. And if we were paying more for our chocolate, hopefully they would be benefiting from that increased income. Not guaranteed, of course, but that would be ideal. But going back to the question of Central and South America, I think that their chocolate was relatively inexpensive, and that's why it was so pervasive. And if we come to the story, back to the stories of the British colonies and North America, chocolate was inexpensive here as well. So people in Newport and Boston and New York, Aaron Lopez was giving chocolate, those chocolate balls probably, to indigent people, to poor people. They wouldn't do that if chocolate was expensive. Chocolate was also given out as rations to prisoners and to soldiers because it was so inexpensive. In Europe, it was more expensive because there were monopolies on chocolate and there were also high taxes on chocolate. So there it was more expensive, and it was also required more shipping and more travel. So for the most part, however, in the northern and southern hemispheres here, chocolate was pretty reasonable.
What surprised you the most as you were doing your research about chocolate?
Well, I'd say there were a lot of surprises along the way. There was also a lot of chocolate eating and tasting and drinking along the way. Not just that there were these many connections. The book also addresses, by the way, Catholics and chocolate, Quakers and chocolate. And when I think about Catholics and their usages of chocolate and Jews and our usages of chocolate, everybody was involved in the business in some form or another at some point or another. But in terms of religious attitudes towards chocolate, Jews never seemed to be ambivalent about chocolate. Catholics were ambivalent about chocolate. We can talk about that some more if you want to, but that certainly was a surprise. But that there was all of this, there was this pervasive interest in chocolate much earlier on. It was very different chocolate, very exotically different from our customary chocolate consumption. It was all a lot of surprises.
So you're not writing a book about cocoa beans or garbanzo beans or vanilla beans, but do you plan on writing another book, and what would the topic be?
So chocolate led me to my current project. Chocolate led me to be interested in chocolate babka. So babka has had a great, there's been a great interest in chocolate babka in the last, 10 years or so here, perhaps in Chicago as well, perhaps other parts of the country as well. And there were, a number of chocolate babka purveyors, more and more, sort of artisanal chocolate babka purveyors. And I was interested in, what is this babka thing? But also the chocolate, what kind of chocolate were people using? But the chocolate led me to become interested in the babka. And then I learned about more celebratory breads developed by Jews, Sephardim, as well as Ashkenazim and Mizrahi Jews from the Middle East, and the wide array of those breads that are used for celebratory occasions. And I'm working on that, including some material about Jewish wedding breads and how exotic they were and how they were used, and there are Jewish wedding dances related to breads, and the polemic of leaven. So I became interested in yeast and leavening, which leads me to matzah, and why is matzah not leaven, and what's the big deal about matzah? Obviously, we have the stories in the Bible, but there's much more about kind of polemics and arguments around yeast and leavening. And it just led me to a lot of interesting material that I'm working on now.
So now you're eating babka and chocolate.
Well, I am eating chocolate still, but unfortunately, I'm into the project about celebratory breads for about a year, actually a year and a half now. And just this past February, I was diagnosed celiac, so I cannot bake any. I did 50 celebratory breads in the first year of the project, but I can bake it, but I can't consume it. So what's the point of baking it?
Well, you're gonna have to figure out how to make it gluten-free then.
Right.
There's a whole nother chapter.
Yeah, so that's what I'm working on. Thanks for asking.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This was really very, very interesting. It was our lowest calorie learning about food and or chocolate ever. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you for the invitation. I hope you all stay healthy, stay well, enjoy the chocolate trail. Lots of blessings on the chocolate trail.
Thank you. Thank you. Please check out our website, jccchicago.org. We have another author tomorrow, Jacqueline Sapir from Miniskirt to Hijab. And then we have a visit to Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin on Thursday. So thank you everyone for joining us. Have a great night and take care.
Thanks so much.